Hello there. I'm Bishop Craig Bergland. We live in a world that has become increasingly violent. The rhetoric of our political discourse, the rhetoric of our entertainment, the rhetoric even of our religion has become, over the 5 decades that I've been on this earth, more and more violent. If we need evidence of this, all we need to look to is the tragic shooting of Congressman Giffords in Arizona and her party. We live in a curious time where the most popular form of Christianity in this country, Protestant fundamentalism, and its cousin, Roman Catholic fundamentalism, have lost sight of the truth that the man they profess to follow, the God-man Jesus Christ, was known as and is known as the Prince of Peace. Instead, what seems to be the most popular religion, not just in North America, but in the whole world, is a form of fundamentalist extremism that believes that violence is an appropriate tool of carrying out one's religious and spiritual agendas, despite the fact that the adherents to the 3 major religions of the book, or any of the Eastern religions, are adherents to religions of peace. How do we explain this? I suppose there's many ways to explain it. What I'm not entirely convinced about is that explaining it is the most valuable way to spend our time right now. What we do know is this: the advent of conservative political and religious motivations, worldviews, the advent of a pseudo-journalistic culture in North America, where journalism no longer involves the facts, but involves saying or doing whatever you need to attract the most amount of attention to yourself, have caused us to regress in this country almost to the point of the fabled days of the Wild Wild West, where it was necessary for everyone to carry a gun on their hip because one never knew where the next piece of violence would crop up. Now, I'm certainly not advocating that approach, but what I am advocating is this: as a moderate to progressive spiritual leader, we moderate to progressive folks need to abandon our history and our practice and our comfort level that causes us to remain in the background, that causes us to remain silent, that makes us hesitant to speak out for fear that we might be seen as somehow impolite, unkind, or rude. In a day when a woman who would like to be the next Republican candidate for president in this country, Sarah Palin, had on her website bullseye targets over the pictures of her political opponents. In a day when the Tea Party-backed Republican candidate who ran against Gabby Giffords was seen dressed in camouflage, carrying an M16 in a promotional piece he did, and advocated that his supporters fire off their machine guns to support him. In a day when the state of Arizona has adapted fascist political stances that now allow Arizona police to stop you just because you look like you might not be a naturalized American citizen. In a day when conservative religious and political commentators use language laced with violence to attempt to motivate their followers to act out. In a day that has seen allegedly religious leaders propose that it's okay to blow up an abortion clinic, that it's okay to shoot an abortion doctor, while at the same time being critical in an almost hysteria-inducing, and if it weren't so sad, hysterically funny because of its hypocritical nature, criticism of Islamic fundamentalists. What they seem to lack is the ability to see that fundamentalism in all its stripes leads to violence. That fundamentalist Christians in this country, fundamentalist Jewish folk in this country, fundamentalist Roman Catholic Christians in this country have been taught that in the name of God it is acceptable, if necessary, to act out violently. This must stop. No longer can moderate to progressive voices afford to sit in the background. We must stand up and non-violently resist this growing culture of violence. We must stand up and say to political figures who use violent language, who imply that violence is acceptable to accomplish goals of any sort, we must stand up and demand that they recant or be removed from the process, regardless of their political affiliation. We must stand up and resist and call out and be critical of and non-violently protest in their own towns. People who claim to be religious leaders, who claim to represent Christianity or Judaism or Islam or any other religious perspective, and claim that in that position they can advocate for violence as part of carrying out this bizarre culture war that's been going on now for decades. You know, there is no reason to believe that what Jesus had in mind was a culture war. The truth is, you cannot have a legitimate Christology, to quote Dietrich Bonhoeffer and paraphrase him actually. You cannot have a valid Christology with a culture war fixation. The only valid Christology, which means the only valid understanding of Christ, is an understanding of Christ in which social justice plays a central part. And violence is never a part of social justice. I live in the city of Milwaukee, where within the last 2 weeks, at a local shopping mall, 50 urban youths started a small riot at the mall, knocking over displays, running through the aisles, terrorizing shoppers. And when interviewed, the reason for their doing this was they were bored and they wanted to have some fun. We moderate to progressive leaders must stand up and say, this is unacceptable fun. And there are consequences to this fun. Whether you are a child in a shopping mall, whether you are a small-minded political figure like Sarah Palin and her handlers, whether you're a local sheriff who believes that human beings ought to be dispatched to tent cities because they don't fit your image of how somebody ought to behave politically, it must end. We must act. These seemingly isolated incidents are happening far too frequently for them to be isolated. Our culture is taking a full-speed reverse regression. We are now back in the 1960s, when we lost a president, we lost his brother, we lost even a conservative, arch-conservative man who probably stood no chance of election when he was shot and paralyzed. We lost the most important civil rights figure ever to walk the earth, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we lost so many more people in the violence either of politics or vigilantism. It must stop. I, for one, can no longer be silent about these things. I, for one, will be calling out those religious and political leaders who advocate violence. I hope you'll join me in this process, in this goal of becoming the enlightened people that the teachings of Jesus Christ and the Buddha and Muhammad and Elijah ought to move us toward being. Instead of the small-minded terrorists that certain political and allegedly religious leaders would have us become. We can no longer afford to be the foot soldiers of violence, of mindless political agendas, of anyone who would target anyone else for any reason. I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll visit my website at christandlight.org and come to understand a spiritual perspective which lies behind this kind of movement. I hope if you haven't yet, you'll read the writings of Dr. King, the nonviolent resistant writings of Gandhi, Saul Alinsky, and others. We must take back our culture. We must take back our streets. And we must take back our political process. I'm Bishop Craig Bergland. God bless, and namaste.